Still going well. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. For those of you who may be new here, the patrons only live chats are different from the big public live chats. Usually about 50, 60 patrons end up watching these presentations. But while we're doing it live, we usually only have about 4, 5, sometimes 10 patrons, which means I interact with every single comment. I answer every single question. I mean, hopefully one of these days a time will come where there are so many patrons I can't do that anymore. But that's how this works. I've got a list of 12 items, some that I came up with, some that were suggested by folks, not just on Twitter, but also on our Discord server, which is something I really don't understand, but is something that all content creators are supposed to have in this day and age, and is being run for me by Logo Cool Extreme, which I'm very grateful for. So the topics have been suggested. We're going to go topic by topic, and we are that's interesting. Anyway, we're going to go topic by topic. Going through this list that I've generated. I'm going to talk about the topic, then we'll discuss whatever comments you guys might have, and then we'll just go on to the next topic. So starting off, I want to talk about AFRICOM. This is something I've always meant to do more of a cover more and really just learn more about, because it is fascinating, and it's, I think, something that I definitely want to delve into more. It's something I only vaguely understand. But AFRICOM is the United States Africa Command. And it turned 13, lucky 13 years old last October 1st, so just a week or so ago. It turned 13, and it has one of the most horrifying records of any institutions on the planet. It's basically the establishment of AFRICOM within 3 years had led to the destruction of North Africa's economic miracle, the destabilization of the European Union, which is a linchpin of U.S. security and sort of imperial control, if you will. Really just an absolute disaster. But to even talk about what AFRICOM is, I think I need to talk about what Unified Combat Commands are. They're actually something that makes a great deal of sense in any military. Really famously, the Japanese military. I was just listening to Hardcore History. What is the name of that guy? Mike Carlin or Dan Carlin? Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He's doing an extraordinary unit on the Imperial Japanese trajectory. And just the incredible horrors that entailed. But one of the things famously about the Japanese military in the 1930s and 1940s was that it was insanely decentralized. Like, you actually had, you didn't physically have the army and the navy fighting each other, but they absolutely had different policies, different ideas of how the war should be run. And because sort of democratic government in Japan kind of fell apart in the 30s and 20s and 30s under a storm of assassinations from the military, we don't even know. Dan Carlin talks about this. We don't even really know who we were supposed to blame for the decisions that the Imperial Japanese made, because it was such a mess of conflicts between different military branches. So that's an extreme, but every military has these problems. Any serious modern military has these problems. The Navy thinks that the Army is full of it. In the U.S., the Marines have sort of genial contempt for everybody. It's a fight. So during World War II, this system of sort of unified commands came about, sort of based on theaters. There's the Atlantic Theater, the Pacific Theater. And of course, as with everything with the U.S. military, this initially useful thing has metastasized into a sort of tremendously complicated system. I think we've now got something like 12 to 15 unified commands. 6 or 7 of them are geographical. I put a link to the map in the description, and then there are a range of other commands. There's Cyber Command, there's Special Forces, JSOCCOM or something, I think, have their own command. So what these commands now are, again, they are, if we were ever in a useful war, they would absolutely, a war that made sense. Like during World War III, we're going to want to have consolidated combat commands because we're going to want to make decisions based on the realities of this, whatever theater is, rather than that is, the parochial interests of the Army or the Navy or the Air Force. But what's happened is, famously, each branch of the U.S. military fights for its own interests and tries to balloon its budget no matter what, they actually need. Now these commands, which are now, some of them have like 50 years of history behind them now, are also lobbying for their own interests. And unfortunately, with these regional commands, what their own interests are more conflict within those commands. One of the, I suppose, because, it's U.S. empire and U.S. empire likes to be comprehensive. During the late Bush administration, folks started really pushing for an Africa command. We had CENTCOM is probably the most famous. CENTCOM is the unified U.S. military combat command that handles everything in the Middle East on into Afghanistan, whether or not you consider that a part of the Middle East. It's the central command. It's sort of, it's funny. One of the profitable things about diving into this, as I did a little bit this morning, is they're very explicit about what they want and what their plans are. You go to the CENTCOM website and you go to About Us, and like the first thing that's there is deter Iran. The first thing about this central command is we want more resources to start a war with Iran. That's basically what they're there for. I'm not saying that deterring Iran or containing Iran is necessarily, I think I'd probably say, if you know my videos, it's probably a generally stupid idea. They're a much more natural ally for us than the Saudis, in that, they have actual power and are actually capable of things. But the idea that, the military is what needs to be making these decisions and lobbying defense companies and lobbying Congress people automatically leads to problems. So CENTCOM, defines itself like we're here to, it's funny on its website, its three priorities are deter Iran. Number two, manage Afghanistan. So they need to update that website. And three, the Islamic State fraud. The Islamic State, which we defeated in the fall of 2017, but everybody's pretending still exists. So, we can continue bombing, selling bombs. But anyway, so that's CENTCOM. So in 2008, folks were like, why don't we have anything that covers Africa? We need an Africa com. In the aughts, that process was put forward. I think it was legally established in 2007, Africa Command, and it officially commenced operations on October 1st, 2008. An interesting thing about these geographical commands is that while there's in Qatar, there's a huge, I think, local headquarters of Central Command. The actual headquarters of Central Command is in Florida. The actual headquarters of Africa Command is in Germany. But yeah, October 1st, 2008, within 3 years, we had destroyed Libya, the economic linchpin of North Africa, a big part of why the 2000s were a truly miraculous decade for Northern Africa and the Sahel. I mean, you saw all of these places experiencing practically a decade of 5 to 10% growth. All of these little countries that we'd become accustomed to seeing as permanently poor since independence in the 2000s. They had this amazing time. So NATO through officially NATO, officially the British and the French, were supposedly leading, and Obama was leading from behind or whatever. But I got buddies who were the actual guys who went in and cleared out the anti-aircraft stuff, the day before the French and the British came in to do their bombing runs. So yeah, that was 100% an AFRICOM deal. So yeah, within 3 years of the founding of the Africa Combat Command, it destroyed, North African prosperity, created this nightmare in Libya that has been spewing weapons and militias across the Sahel for the past 10 years. It's just such extraordinarily nasty failure. And I've actually got 3 more stories that just talk more about the extraordinary failings of AFRICOM. But before I do that, let's go through the comments. Jan Lapper says, so we're establishing where people are from. Jan Lapper's from Switzerland. Logical Extreme is from Malaysia. I have a property to go into school exchange. Oh, interesting. Folks, Johan. Okay. Don't know much about Malaysia. Don't know much about, we're talking about school exchanges. Cool Extreme says, my sleep cycle is ruined beyond repair thanks to college all-nighters. And I think we are, I think the More Freedom Foundation is also contributing to ruining Logo Cool Extreme sleep cycle. I mean, what time is it? It's midnight, right? In Malaysia right now. Mert Muftiel says, speaking of Saudis, if there is time, I wonder how Rob feels about the 2035 KSA projections, financial, etc. I'm not sure what you're referring to. Are there new Saudi Arabian projections that the government has released? I'm not aware of that. Or are you referring to my prediction that Saudi Arabia will, no longer be Saudi by 2030? I still firmly stand by that. As I've talked about in a video, I think Saudi Arabia is Wall Street. I did correct myself. I think I ran a video in 2018 or something mocking the Saudi Arabian investment strategy, talking about how they were creating this absurd tech bubble in the United States, and they were surely going to come to ruin on that. They were the stupid money. That's wrong. Though they did actually bail out of Tesla right before the incredible run-up in prices, they have certainly are heavy investors in the U.S. stock market, contributed to its, the current bubble or boom or what have you, and are profiting off it mightily. What that also means, by the same token, however, is that the Saudi government is tremendously reliant now, not just on oil and gas prices, but also on the success of the U.S. equity markets. I think what strikes me as the end game scenario is there's some kind of crash in the U.S. market. If it's right now, then maybe it's not so much of a problem for the Saudis because we're now in a period of higher oil prices for the first time since 2014. I think both WTI and Brent have hit $80 a barrel for the first time since 2014, the 7-year highs. But I think if 3 or 4 years from now, after the supply chain issues have been sorted out, and oil prices have sunk back down, we then get a stock market crash, which will inevitably lead to another oil and gas price crash. Then I think that's sort of how the Saudi government falls. Yes, I'm still very confident. For MBS and the current Saudi royal family to be in charge of Saudi Arabia in 2030, we not only have to have sustained oil prices, which I don't believe we will have. We will also need to have a continuing U.S. economic boom, and I do not believe we will have that over the course of the coming decade. Maybe we will, but even the Roaring 20s of yore, people still talk about how in the 20th century we had the big worldwide pandemic, the Spanish flu, and then we ended up in the Roaring 20s, and maybe we'll end up in the same way again in the 21st century. Of course, the Roaring 20s ended with the Great Depression, and I do not see Saudi Arabia surviving the next economic downturn. So yes, that is my prediction, and it's not at 2035; it's still at 2030, still holding strong. I've got another 9 years before I'd have to say I was wrong about that. I do have a Saudi Arabia video I've been meaning to run. It is like what's happening in Saudi Arabia right now is the ancien regime. In up until the music stopped in the 1780s for the French royal family, it really did look like the most glorious time imaginable. I mean, the flourishing of French society, French fashion, French philosophy, French science was extraordinary in the run up to, oops, we're out of money, and it all falling apart. And I think it's fair to see the MBS, to the extent that it actually exists, the sort of MBS reforms and attempts at economic diversification as sort of a similar, period of ancien regime glory before that monarchy falls to the benefit of all mankind. So Local Consume says, who deserves more blame for Libya, the U.S. or Europe? I think it's instructive whenever we, as we withdrew from Afghanistan, the extraordinary chorus of anger and betrayal we got from the Europeans. I think that whenever you see that, or as an American, whenever I saw that, all I could think of was Libya and the absolute catastrophe that they dragged us into. And they dragged us into a catastrophe in Libya, just as the Saudis are dragging us into a truly horrific destruction of Yemen. Just like world historical nightmare bullshit. We are perpetrating on Yemen right now. But while certainly I can blame the Saudis or the Europeans for dragging us into this nonsense, I believe that as the entity that has all of the real power and weight behind these decisions, much more in Libya than in Yemen, I believe that the United States deserves the blame for the destruction of Libya. There's a whole wide literature, not from Obama himself, of like, oh, I didn't really want to do it, but the Europeans made me. It's like the Europeans can't make the United States do shit. Obama got pressure from Clinton and the military-industrial complex and whatnot to do it, and that's real. But the buck stops with him. Which Joe Biden has illustrated. I mean, Joe Biden got incredible pressure to keep the Afghanistan fraud going from every corner of the military-industrial complex, all the same schmucks as were pressuring Obama, and he said no. He simply refused to do it. The United States obviously deserves the lion's share of the blame for the destruction of Libya. However, it does color my whenever I hear from our European allies whining about decisions that we make with our money and our troops. I always certainly think of Libya and say, well, that's what happened when we listen to you assholes. Not interested going forward. Martin Muftu says, your prediction, Rob. Scott Locks, what's the relation between the military, Latin America com, and the DEA and the CIA? Well, that's certainly a big question that I'm not capable of. If today's today, actually, I think I'm very well prepared for this presentation, but if this presentation has a theme, it'll come up again when we discuss Daniel Hale. It's just there's just so much complexity that I need to spend more time delving into. Especially because I'm nominally attempting to write a book on U.S. empire at this point. So much complexity, and it's never straightforward. I think I'll talk about that. Where is that? Yeah, actually, specifically with the Guinea coup, which is only our second topic that we're going to talk about. I'll talk about that. It's like it's complex. It's opaque. I'm sure there is a interagency liaison office from Latin America Com. Is there a Latin America Com? It's just SOCOM, right? Yeah, SOCOM, right? the relationship between SOCOM and the DEA and CIA. There's a liaison office. There's with the DEA and CIA, they interact. But the CIA and the DEA have their own conflicting, sometimes conflicting priorities in Latin America? Of course they do. From a military's perspective, until the Trump administration, I would assume that from a military perspective, that was a pretty lazy office, at least since the 1980s. There just wasn't really much of anything for the military to do. And even in the 80s, it was mostly just facilitating, CIA, DEA skullduggery. But with Trump's moves against Venezuela and, putting naval assets into threatening Venezuela, so sort of almost completely forgotten interaction from the early days of COVID, an attempt to distract. But anyway, so like as to those questions, like A, I need to research that more, but B, like there's a real complexity there that isn't just the complexity of, it's difficult to understand. It's the complexity of it doesn't work. It doesn't function well to serve anybody other than the interests of the agencies involved or whatever U.S. military contractors have found ways to profit from that. Not just talking about the folks who sell the missiles, but like Booz Allen Hamilton or consultancies that have figured out ways to slot themselves in. I mean, it is tremendously complex stuff. None of it as I think at this point, I don't think anybody on the patrons only, has a simple-minded view of the U.S. government as to think this. But I get this a lot in the comments where it's like, there was this direct plan to do this bad thing. That's the thing. Like these people aren't evil people. These aren't people with like evil plots. They're like, in Latin America specifically, it's like, we are anti-communist and the communists are bad. We've convinced ourselves that like the communists are this terrible threat. So we end up allying ourselves with the forces of racial hierarchy, because the forces of racial hierarchy, the white people who have always run Latin America, are anti-communists, of course. So even though they're perpetuating like a evil Jim Crow plus situation in some of these countries, and like I'm generalizing massively, that's different problems in every Latin American country, and things have gotten a lot better in a lot of these countries. But certainly in the 70s and 80s, like it wasn't even even some of the worst and most pointless things the CIA was doing in Latin America in the 1980s was never because of like an evil plot. We're gonna go fuck over the indigenous. No, it was more like we are anti-communist and these are people we can interact with who are anti-communist. And yes, those people had really awful, like horrifying anti-indigenous, anti-poor people agendas, but the U.S. just wanted to kill commies, and they gave us communist bodies, but that happened to be indigenous and poor people. But anyway, perhaps I'm confusing things. Let's talk about complexity. Related to the Guinea coup. This is something else. So most of what AFRICOM does is not say, we're going to sinisterly undermine African countries. We're going to destroy their economies. No, they think they're being helpful because this is what the military knows how to do. The military thinks it's going to be helpful by going in and training military forces to go defeat the jihadists we unleashed by destroying Libya. It's sort of a perpetual motion machine. So we're being helpful, but what we end up doing in practice is we end up shoring up strongmen and convincing democratically elected people to act more like strongmen because we have beefed up their militaries and given them that opportunity to do so, creating even more negative cycles. And the Guinea coup is an excellent example of this. So the coup that happened in Guinea, I think it was in mid-September, I didn't get the exact date down, was incredibly humiliating enough to make it into the New York Times under this headline. I've got the link in the description below, because the guys who carried out the coup in Guinea, and the U.S. is officially very against coups, even legally against coups. The people who carried out the coup literally left a U.S. Special Forces training camp to go into the Capitol and take over the government. And that, I mean, that's like one of those just like, oh my gosh, like, because it looks horrifically terrible. I mean, these are literally people we were training while they were on our training course, went and took over the government. Now, were the people in the United States in some kind of sinister CIA AFRICOM plot being like, yes, we are putting together the next government of Guinea? Of course not. People, were probably interpreting it that way. But this is the world that AFRICOM has created, this idea of beefed up military forces, this idea that the only appropriate way to support an African country is to beef up their military, dump more money into that, and go out into the bush and fight people who are, might have a jihadist ideology, but also might just have a completely legitimate grievance against this nasty strongman that the U.S. government is beefing up. So it's not, it is humiliating that, folks that the U.S. was spending money on training went directly from the training camp to carry out a coup, but that was not the plan. The problem is that the well-meaning plans that AFRICOM has, that the U.S. government has for this entire region, are militarized and lead to a more militarized environment. I looked into the history of this Guinea coup in particular, and it's particularly sad, as is the story in Mali, which we'll get into with the next unit. Alpha Conde, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, was, I think, the first popularly elected Guinean president in independence. He was popularly reelected in 2015 and then again in 2020. The problem, of course, he's also, I think my understanding, he's fairly elderly, he's in his mid 80s. But also, he was by constitution only supposed to have 2 5-year terms, yet he changed the constitution to get reelected in 2020 as a sort of a common strongman move, over protests that were crushed. That doesn't mean he didn't have popular legitimacy, but he thought he could get away with doing this. He became more of a strongman because Guinea, like all of the governments in the Sahel, had its military tremendously beefed up by U.S. AFRICOM counter-terror money. So he had the strength to become a strongman because of U.S. counter-terror money, and then there was a coup that was carried out against him by exactly the stronger military that had been paid for by U.S. money. So no, there isn't some sinister plot here. This isn't that, the CIA just hates popularly elected governments in Africa. It's just that we have dumb policies that AFRICOM advocates for, because AFRICOM doesn't want to do development. AFRICOM doesn't want to help out democratic stuff. AFRICOM is a military institution, and the only way that it knows how to help Africa is to, fight the jihadists it created by destroying Libya and give these African countries more money to be more violent and be more militaristic, which yields a more violent and militaristic situation, which sucks. Okay, let's go to. Let's see. Let's see. This time, so, what is the relation between military and Latin America? Okay, I think I answered that. The pandemic has. Yeah, Logical Extreme says the pandemic has destroyed my fragile understanding of economics, and that I've become a financial crash truther, and that I don't believe it is coming. I honestly, speaking as someone who has been sort of bearish for what feels like a decade now, expecting the next crash to come, and then just watching, my retirement accounts and everybody else's just go up, 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 up. It's I think it's quite it is quite rational for folks to say, well, I guess the crash is never coming. This time really is different. I'm here to tell you that everybody always believes this time is different. And I firmly believe that a crash is coming. Is it coming this year? Is it coming next year? I don't know. Is it going to happen in the next decade? Yes, no question. There are all these things. Is it the Chinese property markets cracking up? Is it the fucking debt ceiling, which we'll get to in a minute? Basically, the Republican Party sabotaging the U.S. government and creating a default. I mean, that's something that could crash the world economy immediately. I mean, it's so yeah. Like I am totally sympathetic to the idea that okay, there's always supposedly going to be a crash coming, but it keeps not happening. And I think there are, arguments to be made that that the Federal Reserve has taken on a sort of duty to basically just keep things inflating forever. And judging from the capabilities they've demonstrated over the past year, it's actually hard to deny that, maybe they really could do it. But at some point, something will intervene. And it's probably going to be grim. Let's see. We have more discussions. People talking about the where folks are from. Local Extreme says it irritates me to hear the concept of U.S. presidents being pressured by the MIC. How about these clowns nut up and do the job that people elected them to do? I would agree with that, but I do think it is a little more nuanced. I mean, presidents are single people, and when everybody who is telling them everything about the world, it's sort of a brain sickness in the United States. People really do believe the world is like more dangerous than it's ever been, or it's Hobbesian, or it's scary, or it's because we have this tremendous military industrial complex. It's not just the military, it's all of our media, all of everybody, all of social media is just really invested in this idea that things are so screwed up now, and they're really not. Like it's almost exclusively the US military industrial complex making the world more dangerous right now. And of course, the reason the world is as safe as it is because of the overwhelming power of US hegemony. So it's I'm not a pacifist. I'm someone who thinks that the U.S. military budget should absolutely be cut in half. But and I think it would probably be a stronger, more dangerous military for it. But I'm not someone who believes the world would be better off without U.S. military power. The problem is that with all this U.S. military power, there's all these people who have to convince themselves there's value to what they're doing. So they keep doing violent and destructive things that sort of risk, the accomplishments of U.S. empire, if that makes any sense. But I don't think we understand fully. That's why what I'm so impressed with what Biden did in Afghanistan is just like the environment of the U.S. president never interacts with anybody whose paycheck doesn't depend on the myth that the world is incredibly dangerous, and that doesn't depend on the myth. The U.S. president never interacts with anybody who doesn't depend on the myth that U.S. military action is positive for the world rather than a detriment. So yeah, absolutely. Like, not, I'm not, Obama, a sympathetic guy, I think is a mass murderer, and will burn in hell for the things that he allowed to happen. As the same as I do with Trump and Bush. I think that Biden is a mass murderer, even though he stopped the war in Afghanistan. I mean, who knows? I mean, maybe Joe Biden will be just this incredible guy who stops the slaughter in Afghanistan the first year and Yemen the second year and signs a big deal with the Iran nuclear, in the third year and turns into this amazing peace happy president. Inaugurating a new chance at sort of a war-free utopia. But I highly doubt that's going to happen. So I think it's likely that having gotten this one really great thing out of Joe Biden, which he probably wouldn't even have been capable of starting himself. One of the main reasons that Biden was able to get out of Afghanistan politically is that he could very plausibly sell it as him finishing a job that Trump started. I think he was joking. I think there was some talk about the Nobel Peace Prize. Was that announced? I don't even know who got it this year, but I think it might have been announced recently. I think Trump and Biden should have actually gotten a joint Nobel Peace Prize for defeating the military-industrial complex to stop the slaughter in Afghanistan. I don't exonerate U.S. presidents, but I'm not surprised by their failure to stop horrible things that the U.S. government is doing to the world, to stop the way that U.S. empire is currently self-sabotaging itself. Jan Levers is interesting. Michigan, like Rob, if I'm not completely mistaken. I spend a lot of time in Michigan. I'm very devoted to Michigan. I went to school there. My mother's family has had a house in northern Michigan for a century now. But no, I'm actually from Connecticut. So I grew up in the New York City suburbs. Actually was born in New York City and lived here until I was 9, and then moved out to the New York City suburbs. I'm a New Yorker. Jan Lauber, here, whatever they say in Parliament. Martin Mofti says, logo stream, people may cast the votes, but the lobbyists fund a lot too, 100%. Scott Lux says, Rob is from the East Coast, but went to a school in Michigan, family has a house in Lake Michigan. Well, that Scott Lux is comprehensive knowledge. Well done. Lauber is a French name. Jan Lauber, no German. Jan Lauber is, we're talking about more where people's from. Only 3. Scott Lux says there are only 3 U.S. military bases left in Latin America: Colombia, Honduras, and Galapagos Islands. Really? Is that like some kind of research station? Wow. Well, let's not forget Guantanamo Bay, of course. That's a pretty important U.S. military base. Logo Cool Extreme says, Scott, I seem to recall there being one in Brazil. I do not know where all the U.S. bases are. There are literally hundreds of them. Scott Lux says, maybe Bolsonaro let one open after Lula and his predecessor left. You're probably right. For sure, Lula wanted no part of the U.S. military. Fadel says, did I miss the Iraq election talk? No, you did not. That is much further down the list. We are already 38 minutes in, and we have made it to 2 out of 12 topics. I want to talk about the Russians in Mali. This is another big issue. So the French military-industrial complex has also joined in profiting off of our destruction of Libya, specifically in Mali. It was a very early. It's really quite sad. I had a downstairs neighbor who was from Mali in my 20s, and Mali was, it was just a happy place. I'm sure incredibly impoverished or whatnot, but it was a place that was very much on the upswing until we took out Gaddafi, and within 6 months, the weapons and sort of jihadi militias swept across Mali. Sort of destabilizing the place. I think one of my favorite data points on Mali is that Mali has had 5 coups since independence in 1960 or thereabouts. Don't quote me on that. So Mali was French. I think it was 60, the big boom for French independence. But I think it was 1960. So they've had 5 coups, 5 sort of the military illegitimately taking over the government since independence in 1960. So yeah, it's not just U.S. military intervention that brings about coups. However, that's 6 decades, 5 coups. 3 of those 5 coups have been in the past 10 years since the U.S. destruction of Libya and North Africa's prosperity of the 2000s. It's a tremendous mess. The French have Operation Barkhane or something, which is a couple thousand French troops, and also a massive force of African troops. Chad, Idriss Deby, the president of Chad, was a famous French client and much stabler than the other nations in the Sahel until he was actually killed in battle earlier this year. But perhaps in part because of the death of Idris Deby, France is, and the fact that they've been killing jihadists for a decade, and I think the French public and even the French military is kind of realizing, oh wait, this doesn't actually help anything. The problem is worse than when we got here. Maybe we're the problem. So the French are considering pulling out, but of course they've created a Malian government. With this over militarization, this destruction of Libya has led to a Malian government that is a bunch of military strongmen. I think 2 of those 5 coups have happened in the past 18 months. So it's a bunch of very militarized counterterrorism expert folks in government who really want to continue having Western military savvy. So the Russians have stepped up, as the French have said they want to pull out. The Russians are like, well, we're happy to send our Wagner mercenaries. It's just one of the most extraordinary things about this article I read. It's linked in the description. Is that the Russian mercenaries supposedly to come in with 1,000 troops. And I don't know that these 1,000 troops would all be Russians. Perhaps they're also sort of, from a variety of African countries as well. I don't know. But the price that they wanted for 1,000 troops was $10 million a month, which is, sounds, it's significant money. But the $10 million can buy you 1,000 Russian mercenaries for a month. That's extraordinary. Like, it's amazing how cheap that is. And it's amazing that, and it's a sign of U.S. power that we continue to have so many more people more interested in paying for infinitely more for our protection than for the Russians. But that just kind of blew my mind. But it is, this is sort of the French are angry. The U.S. is disturbed by the idea that Mali could go from having French troops there to having Russian troops there. And it's entirely possible that French objections will shut this down. The French are no longer nominally no longer the imperial masters in West Africa, but they have much more influence than is frankly appropriate. So whether or not these Russians in Mali will ever happen, but it's key to point out that this too is a situation that the instantiation of AFRICOM 13 years ago led to. And so not even from like my woo-woo hippie peace and love pacifist, that's not how I would describe myself, but perhaps how others might. Sure, AFRICOM's obvious and transparent failure, but even from the perspective of like U.S. war hawks, having the Russians Russian mercenaries having a serious presence in Mali, that's a very clear indication of AFRICOM's complete failure, even by the standards of U.S. militarists. So there you are. Finally, Fado. Let's get maybe Bolsonaro. Did miss those stuck. Brando Commando says, hello, Brando. Fado says, a lot of the people who destabilized Mali used to be funded by Gaddafi. Yes, exactly. Local seems, I, for one, am in full support of any move that annoys France. Hence why AUKUS doesn't irritate me too much. Yeah, no, I agree. It is always tremendously satisfying to be annoyed by France. It's interesting though. Like I have often, in my 20s, 30s, I was a big supporter of the Iraq War. So fuck the French. I've always enjoyed making fun of the French, but it's also, I also have an appreciation for the French and the way that they have, continued to persist, despite the predictions of, Reaganite neoliberal folks for 40 years. Their inefficient socialist economy has, just sort of rocketed along. They've got better. They reproduce at higher rates than anybody else in Europe. Now probably higher rates than anyone in the U.S. Like they're still there. They still do have independent power. I mean, sure, it's not like. It's not, enough independent power to mean anything in Asia, but it does mean stuff in the Mediterranean. Like they are still a real power to a degree, which I've latterly come to appreciate a little bit more. especially as the British have sort of ossified into just a barely functional division of the U.S. empire. But yeah, no, yeah, I totally get along with mocking the French. And also, they're not that independent of the United States. It's a huge deal. They, I guess that also happened this month. I should probably mention that. I mean, they withdrew their ambassadors from the United States over losing this submarine deal, being replaced by the U.S. and Britain. I mean, they didn't remove, as I said in my video on AUKUS earlier this month. They didn't. AUKUS, for those who might not know, is the Australia, UK, US deal to do some nuclear proliferation. Yes, they're not nuclear armed submarines, they're just nuclear propelled submarines. But Australia would be the only non-nuclear power to operate nuclear submarines. It requires, to fuel these monstrosities, requires highly enriched uranium, which is, of course, exactly what we are starving Iran to death over right now. I think there's been a lot of kind of ridiculous border policing on, you have to understand they're really only nuclear propelled, not nuclear armed, which is the fact that Boris Johnson, Scott Morrison, is he the Australian Prime Minister, and Joe Biden all had a paragraph saying, we swear this isn't proliferation, and we swear that the Australians will never have nukes. If a politician is really emphasizing something, you can usually tell he's lying. But anyway, sorry, getting off topic. I too am always delighted. But yeah, France does have a degree of independence. It does have a degree of a real foreign policy of its own that really nobody other than China and Turkey, France, United States, Russia, of course. But I mean, it still is kind of, I would absolutely like to see it removed from the Security Council in the name of a single European Union seat. But no, like, France is still a real power, perhaps begrudgingly admitting that. But even with this insane kerfluffle, even withdrawing ambassadors, which is a very big move in diplomacy, it's sort of quickly been restored and smoothed over, and we're all pals again. So yeah. Full sport. Black Metal Silly says the video on AUKUS and the nuclear submarines the other week was quite educational. I didn't know that there is such a difference to diesel and nuclear submarines. I mean, there's huge difference in terms of technology, in terms of the distance they can go, in terms of silence. You can use a nuclear submarine to annihilate other people's cities after your own country has been in dust for months. So yeah. Though I have gotten some pushback that apparently with, modern satellites, this, that, and the other thing, maybe nuclear submarines are nowhere near as, doomsday weaponish as I portrayed them to be. Of course, my counter argument to that is, well, in the first 2 or 3 days of war between the United States and China, every satellite in the air is going to be knocked out, like all of them. It's just quite simply, like, you're going to blow up 5 of them, and then the sort of debris field will take out every other satellite in the sky. So those submarines will in fact be important. But let's see. For some reason, Brazil is also developing domestically their own nuclear subs. My wife was shocked when we read the Economist article about it. Yeah, it is quite shocking, frankly. And that's one of the extraordinarily irresponsible things about this move to proliferate the technology to Australia. As I said, it was literally in the horror after Sputnik. I would argue we'd sort of already won the Cold War by that point, but in terms of, understandably, the thoughts of U.S. planners, this was one of the lowest points of the Cold War. In 1958, the Russians, had put the first satellite in the sky. We thought that was going to be directing nukes at us in new ways. I mean, that's the context for the only other time that we proliferated nuclear submarines to another country, the United Kingdom in 1958. The idea, as we'll talk in Taiwan next, the very idea that China is somehow a threat on the level of, like, 1958 Soviet Union Sputnik is insane to me. And even during the closing decades of the Cold War, the US acted very firmly to block the proliferation of this technology, even by our allies. We refused to share nuclear technology with France at the height of the Cold War. So they had to build their own. I understand that Brazil and was it Japan or South Korea? There were other instances of our allies saying, "Oh, we want to do nuclear submarines," and we either bribing or like strongly encouraging them not to do so. So it is a pretty extraordinary departure that we're doing this, and I think I can't make any. It might be irresponsible, but I do kind of see it as like, oh, okay, Joe Biden took Afghanistan away from the military-industrial complex, so we're giving them this Australia deal, which will be tens and tens of billions of dollars. Let's see. For some reason, Brazil's also doing on nuclear subs. But yeah, so anyway, so all of these countries that the United States dissuaded or bribed or intimidated out of doing nuclear submarines are like, wait, you're just fucking giving this to Australia now? So yeah, the Brazilian nuclear program will probably be reinvigorated. The South Korean, Japanese, it's just a truly insane. As I said, there's sort of like there's like two levels to geopolitics. There's the vast majority of the stuff we talk about, which is important and matters, and from year to year, decade to decade. And then there's nuclear proliferation, which is like every step outside of Pandora's box is something that 100 years from now we're going to have to deal with nuclear technology controlled by Australia. When who knows, maybe it's a part of Indonesia, 100 years from now. I don't know, but so much of what we discuss is within, contexts of, the politics of the day, the aftermath of the Cold War, the aftermath of the Enlightenment, whatever. Like, it's just, you can put them into these historical timelines that are actually quite distinct. Nuclear proliferation is just like, if a country gets nukes, because of the way that we've proved, if you get rid of your nukes, is with Libya and Iraq, you get got. If you hold on to your nukes, like North Korea, you're immortal. Which is even if the U.S. had illustrated that, that's kind of an obvious point of common sense. So that timeline of a country gets nukes, as long as that country exists, it's going to have nukes. And yes, Australia hasn't taken on nuclear weapons yet, but the proliferation of this technology that requires highly enriched uranium, it's pretty damn close, as the denials of all three heads of state make pretty clear. Let's see. The video on AUKUS and nuclear submarines logo cool extreme. Brando Commando, join our yes, everybody. If you're here, if you're a patron, please do join our Discord community. It's something I'm beginning to enjoy. The way it's functioning thus far is mostly just folks, patrons, bringing stuff to my attention and everybody else's attention, and it's a sort of a private group chat. It's kind of like a WhatsApp group where we discuss developments, and it's also a great way for patrons to. I think, actually on this chat right now, Fadel has done an amazing job just keeping me honest and paying attention to Libya. It's a small country that had incredibly outsized effects, but it's easy for me to lose touch. Fadel constantly brings me into touch with what's happening in Libya. Scott has really been instrumental in convincing me to cover Latin America a little bit more. I think next month I'm going to really, I'm sort of, outside of the channel, I have sort of projects of my own. Like this month, I'm working a lot on sketching or whatever. But next month, I think I'm going to really work on Spanish language so I can do more Latin America content. But Scott's been really instrumental in dragging me towards more Latin America stuff, which I really want to do. I want to cover everything, but it's really tremendously helpful for me to have patrons who keep me apprised of what's actually going on in these places and keep me focused on it. And I think that the patrons only Discord is a great place to do that. And also we all just sort of discuss, we've got, about 5-10 people who interact pretty regularly on the Discord now. And I mean, who knows, maybe that'll gonna get unwieldy at some point, but I think that the Discord is a great place to sort of keep this discussion ongoing. where everybody sort of sees it, everybody reads it in one stream, a little more consolidated than Twitter. So yeah, but you should also follow me on Twitter at RobOLaw and like and retweet my shit. Anyway, let's see. So yeah, that's a pitch for the Discord. There's a link to sign up for the Discord, is I think the first thing in the video description, right above all the links related to the stories we're discussing today. Black Metal Silly says, having done military service in naval forces, I remember one of our staff officers training giving us a speech about having sea mines as kind of a super weapon for our submarines, as having kind of a super weapon for our Navy. That was similarly new information out of the box. Black Metal says, sea mines are, I believe, the strongest weapon against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Your thoughts? Are we talking sea mines or submarines? I'm confused. Local Extreme, Sputnik was very efficient in making a sound that went beep, beep, beep. Yeah, I mean, Sputnik, it turns out, wasn't actually, you know, the super weapon we were terrified of. But, you know, the Soviet Union put the first satellite in space. And that is something that, you know, you could see with telescopes and was terrifying. I think rightly terrifying. And, you know, changed the world. Black Metal Silly, look, I'm not familiar enough with the details to comment myself. But I get the feeling that the foreign policy establishment wants to balkanize China. God, I hope not. I think that'd be incredibly stupid. What I'm really worried about is more transparent efforts to balkanize Iran. I think that's a more real concern. I mean, my sense is that even now, I think free Tibet is something that the U.S. has given up on. I don't think even now with the Xinjiang cultural genocide stuff, I don't think anybody's trying to carve Xinjiang off. And I don't think there's really, I mean, I guess maybe some aspects of, there's really nothing else that can be carved off of China that way, I think, to really truly balkanize it. But I am very worried about specifically, you know, the close relationship that Israel and the United States are forming with Azerbaijan, because, you know, Iran has significant Azeri populations. You know, I don't. It's funny because I don't think there's anybody on here who's like a de facto hawk. It's just like there's nobody sitting in Washington D.C. because I know there's a lot of people who would hear that like, oh, we have this plan to balkanize Iran, who'd be like, good, that sounds fun. That sounds smart. Iran is such a threat to us, which it's not, that we should create something like Syria, but 4 times the size, that would destabilize everything, including most of the world's oil supplies. Like, let's destroy a country of 80 million. But that's an instinct that nobody like comes up and says, hey, guys, war is bad. To folks in the U.S. and Israeli governments. But yeah, there's definitely, I think it's not hard to see a growing attempt to use the Azeri population of Iran to balkanize the place, which would be really bad. By balkanize, I mean truly like attempt to like break up the way Yugoslavia was broken up, mostly by the guy in charge of Yugoslavia at that time, Slobodan Milosevic. Black Metal Silly, but Taiwan's location is quite different from how the Baltic Sea is. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Local coastal stream, understandable. Skylocks, I just checked for a U.S. base in Brazil. It said Bolsonaro offered the U.S. one, but his military refused. That's funny. So not the U.S. military refused, but Bolsonaro wanted to give us a base, but the military that he's so eager to organize a coup in favor of, you know, said, what the fuck, man? Like, even the Brazilian military has more of a sense of self-respect than to want a U.S. base there, which is kind of funny. Maybe Brazil with nuclear subs has aspirations, maybe. My history teacher some years ago said the U.S. does not respect the sovereignty of non-white people, especially. That's undeniable. And the AUKUS thing in particular, it's like, wait, so Australia, this sort of rinky-dink country on the other side of Asia, that's the people we're going to, you know, proliferate nuclear submarines to, not the Japanese, you know, who have our bases there. And to be fair, I think there maybe would be some opposition within Japan to that idea, than more so than there would be in Australia. But not the Koreans, not the Japanese, not the Filipinos, a place that we actually owned for 50 years. It's the Australians, of course, because we just feel closer to them because they're white people who speak English. So yeah, and maybe you could argue that an affinity for white people who speak English, and that's a thing that I meant to include in the AUKUS video that I didn't. What's interesting about and perhaps because it's such an imperial focus about the United Kingdom, about Australia, about the United States. All three of these places very much have racist forces that are trying to destroy each country's immigration miracles, no question. But all three of these places do a vastly better job at incorporating immigrants and sort of assimilating people into the broader sense of what it means to be British, what it means to be American, what it means to be Australian. I'm sure there's in the grand horseshoe theory of white supremacists to leftist, anti-colonialists, post-colonialists, you could find both who find that equally troubling. How could you assimilate, people of color? How could you assimilate those bad people of color into our national polity? And how could you force the heroic people of color to be part of your, imperial views or whatnot? But those AUKUS countries, I think it's reductive to say, it's this white supremacist thing, because actually each of those countries in separate ways, and the U.S. vastly better than either of the other two, I think does have a real interest, not just a propaganda interest, in diversifying itself, in having a character beyond whiteness, which is kind of an interesting complication of that sort of English speaking Anglosphere thing. Anybody can speak English. Anybody who buys in to the way we see the world can be not just accepted in our communities, can be very powerful in our communities. Barack Obama being one example. So yeah, that's like a bit of a complication there. But yeah, you're absolutely right that the U.S. Does not trust non-white countries as much, but also doesn't really trust non-English speaking countries as much, as is evidenced by the sort of recent kerfluffle with France, which is kind of interesting. Local question is Federal China is too big and too ethnically homogenous to balkanize thanks to Mao's cynicism. Well, that's a very sweeping statement, Loga. China has a core along the coast, probably more so than 150 years, incorporating the North and South. They're more closely tied together than they were 150 years ago. Because let's keep in mind, Manchuria. Those were the folks the Manchus were the folks who conquered China in the 1600s and then sort of Sinicized themselves very enthusiastically. But that there's weirdness there that really came up. I've been reading a lot about the Chinese Civil War in the early 20th century. And also, the North was more thoroughly colonized by the Japanese. The real, and so that could conceivably be something that breaks apart. But I think, in part because of the Sinicization process that Logo's talking about, I think that would be harder to break apart. Like Peter Zeihan, for example, I finally read one of his books, thinks that, it's all going to fall apart like the Warring States period. I find that even beyond Mao's Sinicization, I find that hard to credit because of just sort of ideas of national ideology and just literacy that came into play post China's industrialization that make China more durable. But as you get out to the margins of China, not just the Tibet and Xinjiang, but also Mongol areas that were previously pretty okay being part of China, but because the Chinese government is so stupid, they've been repressing Mongols a lot. So there's the Hui, sort of another Muslim minority within China that is not Uyghur. I mean, it's interesting because as you get further away from the coasts, China does have sort of gradations of potentially balkanizable areas. But I don't see it happening. I'm not sure if it's strictly down to Mao's sinicization. It's like bigger, longer term processes as well. But yeah, no, but yeah, I mean that is an interesting point, Logan. Local assumed that does not stop the foreign policy establishment from writing about it. That's true. But I don't like. Have you seen people seriously within the foreign policy establishment advocating for the independence of Tibet or Xinjiang this century? Because I'm not sure I have, which is interesting because as we'll discuss, oh my God, we're already an hour away and only halfway through. As we'll discuss later, as we get into, we have seen recently in U.S.-China relations, we have seen sacred cows getting tipped over, the U.S. acting extraordinarily aggressively in new ways. But even with all of that, I don't think I've seen real calls within, people are going to be writing in foreign affairs, people, within official halls. I don't think I've seen any real calls for the independence of Xinjiang or Tibet recently. Maybe like Steve Bannon or something, but I haven't seen that. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong, Fuddle. Scott Lux, but is that sort of thing coming? Absolutely. I mean, if we've already got troops in Taiwan, which just blows my mind that this isn't the biggest story in the world, this revelation from Thursday. But yeah. Let's see. Scott Lux says Brazil is a $2 trillion economy and has a developing military industrial complex. That's true. And honestly, Brazil had an amazing, and actually maybe things are going to turn up for Brazil because supposedly we're in another. Many argue that our recent commodity tightness is a after effect of strictly the pandemic, and once supply chains get sorted out and production heats up, then the commodities are going to get cheap again. But maybe we are at the start of another commodity supercycle, and those are traditionally great for Brazil. The thing about Brazil is that it does this every time there's a commodities. Commodities go up, Brazil does amazingly. Commodities go down, Brazil does terribly. There's a really messed up line on Brazil. Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. And I think that's, of course, that's incredibly reductive, but I do think there's a little bit of truth there. Local Cool Extreme says the balkanization of Iran is very possible, and the threat of it would be great to the mullahs. Fear of balkanization essentially turned Pakistan away from secularism. Oh, interesting. Yeah, that is a very interesting point. God, I need to know so much more about Pakistan. French media is still talking about partitioning Libya, even though Libya has a strong national identity. Oh, the French. Oh, the French. And why would you partition a country of 6 million? It's just insane. Like, why would you create a division there, like another dispute? So, like, what the East would just inevitably become sort of an Egyptian satellite state, and then the West would be, actually Libya. Yeah, it sounds like a terrible idea. Local Extreme, it still amazes me. There are more Azeris in Iran than there are in all of Azerbaijan. Well, I mean, yes, that is amazing. But Azerbaijan is a country of 10 million, right? And Iran is a country of 80 million. So that will have an effect. Yal Napper, Robert, are you aware that the Japanese self-defense forces restrict their inventory of weapons due to their constitution? Yes, very aware. I'm also aware, and this is like one of the really key parts of Obama's aggression against China that has completely been forgotten. In 2015, Shinzo Abe was interested in this as well, but facilitated by extreme U.S. pressure, aspects of that traditional constitutional stance by Japan were done away with. To some, I don't think I think I describe it sometimes in a quick hand of Japan renounced pacifism, which overdoes it, of course. But yeah, that shift in 2015 was huge. Japan still retains, as I was talking about, it seems unlikely that Japan would take nuclear submarines because of, that's more offensive in nature. It's the Japanese Defense Forces. It's solely for self-defense. But I think that even just for self-defense, the Japanese military is already in the top 10 and certainly is a very significant force, even with the strictures of the Japanese constitution. It's become a very significant force, and some of those strictures, or perhaps just the interpretation of those strictures, changed significantly in 2015, and we will see greater changes. That's probably, that shift in the Japanese constitution is probably a bigger deal in AUKUS than AUKUS. AUKUS obviously has much larger nuclear proliferation aspects, but in terms of like a threat to China, Japan shifting to a less pacifist stance is a much bigger deal than, oh, great, some assholes 3,000 miles away have nuclear submarines. So yeah. But yes, I am aware of the Japanese self-defense forces having those strictures. I am not familiar with the minutiae of how that works, and I should probably get more familiar, because that's sort of a key part of my critique of, actually Obama didn't start being aggressive towards China. Trump didn't start aggression towards China. Obama was extraordinarily aggressive towards China. But I should probably have it at my command exactly what those changes were with the Japanese constitution and posture in 2015. The Middle East is a fabulously diverse place. Truth. Jan Lapper says, Jan Lapper, Japan is noted to have among the most advanced conventional, i.e. diesel submarines, but notably they only carry anti-shipping weapons, no missiles, etc. Yeah, it is fascinating, like the hoops that the Japanese military drives itself through. But the key, Japan is one of those things where its nuclear breakout period is probably about 5 minutes. They have the ability to rapidly become a much more aggressive force, and because of the nature of their what's the word I'm looking for? Because of the nature of their constitution for the past 50 years, Japan has tried to assume tremendously detailed plans about how to very quickly become a more aggressive force, over the course of days or weeks rather than months and years. So yeah. Rami Akilik says, Gold Extreme Persia was run by Turkish dynasties for around 700 years. Yeah. So one of the great horrors of Turkey, Iran, that's sort of the Near East, if you will, about the sort of, the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, really, not just the Near East, almost everything in between China and most everything between China and Vienna, is that it was ruled by Turkic guys who mostly spoke Persian that was written in an Arabic script. And that's why European nationalism, which has completely taken over the world, was such a horrible thing for a lot of really the world in between China and Vienna. China had Chinese, the Japanese, maybe the Thais, but mostly the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Europeans slotted rather nicely into, actually also incredibly violently, look at World War II and the Bloodlands, but into ideas of sort of really French-British nationalism, and this is a country, this is a nation state. But just that the gunpowder empires, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Safavids, Safavids of Iran, Mughals of India, they were, I think it's really reductive and kind of like Turkish nationalist to be like, oh, the Iranians were run by Turks. And technically, yeah, the Indian Empire was run by Turks. I think Babur, the founder of the Mughal Empire, was technically Turkic, or was he more Mongol? But yeah, but like what that actually means is kind of, because it wasn't divided that way. It wasn't that like sort of European nationalist ideal. It was, Turkic folks, descendants of the steppe warriors, who spoke mostly Persian, written in an Arabic script, following an Arab religion, Islam. So yeah, to say that they were Turkic or Turkish is a little reductive, Rami. So I wouldn't, it's sort of it's applying a way of thinking that did not apply when those Turkic dynasties were running Persia and also running India. and most of the Middle East. Local Extreme says, it amazes me to see British people whine about immigration. Who exactly do you think runs your precious National Health Service? Agreed entirely. Fadel says, Inner Mongolia is still not that homogenous. Yes, I think we were talking about China in the context of China and balkanization. Rami Ilgish joined our community chief Discord. Yep, we've got folks signing up for Discord. That is amazing. Fadel, Noah Smith is kind of, God, I actually was kind of bummed. One of the first times I was bummed that Noah Smith, a Bloomberg columnist, whose work I really, really enjoy, but on most topics, but has become like one of the most vicious anti-China people on Twitter. And I would confront him when he said that, and then he would, fail to argue with me, and then eventually blocked me. But yeah, Noah Smith is that doesn't subscribe. It really is strange that, like, does he have like a Taiwanese partner, or had a crush on a Taiwanese person growing up, or something? I don't know, but like, it's just this weird guy, this guy who writes from Bloomberg, who writes interesting things about economics, just sort of neoliberal leaning left, generally interesting fella. Who just hates China and thinks that China is evil, or like everything we do against China is cool. It doesn't surprise me at all. Like, I mean, he's just basically an anti-China bigot, which is very mystifying. It's a real pity, because I did enjoy following him on Twitter. Ramiko says, thanks. Fadel says, Haftarstan, talking about Libya. Fadel says, South Korea also has a powerful liberty. Scott Locks, what's your we are running out of time here. Scott Locks, what is your take on German elections? Unlikely FDA Greens in power with SPD. Scott Locks says EU. We'll talk more about that. Local Extreme, Rami, though interesting. I mean, the Greens, I think, kind of collapsed, didn't they, in the run up to the German election? Rami Ilkic, are you from Iran? Local Extreme, I am Turkish. Like Rob likes Anglo-Saxon history, I like Turkish history. Of course, I like Turkish history too. Fadal, Japan did crackdown for saying it lightly on its minority. Japan did crackdown for saying it lightly on its minorities. I don't really follow that, Fadal. Farzam says, I am Azeri Iranian. Oh, that's interesting, Farzam. I did not know that. And Farzam has joined on Patreon. That's great. Local Extreme says, look, I love Taiwan as much as the next guy. They remind me very much of my fellow Chinese Malaysian brothers. But poking China with a stick is asking for trouble. Is it? Like, if you told me 6 months ago that we were going to abandon strategic ambiguity and have U.S. soldiers in Taiwan, and China wasn't going to do fucking anything other than fly some planes into their advanced defense integrate, like, it's mind-blowing. Stuff that 6 months ago or a year ago anybody would have told you would have been an automatic World War III, and China isn't doing anything. I'm really getting to the point where it's like China is a paper tiger, like, not in like the Zihan sense, oh, they're going to fall apart or their economy is guaranteed to, but just they have no, like, the fact that the Wall Street Journal revealed that we had U.S. soldiers on the ground in Taiwan for over a year. So China's been aware of this. There's no way they wouldn't know that there were U.S. soldiers they have a very significant spy network within Taiwan, as Taiwan has within China. These are very interpenetrated economies. Foxconn, the Taiwanese company, makes all of the iPhones in China, in mainland China. These are very interpenetrated countries. There's no way that that the Chinese government didn't know that Trump had put U.S. soldiers on Taiwan, and that there has been no real response from China other than, oh, we're flying stuff in your expanded definition of airspace. I'm very weirded out. Turns out maybe there's nothing to the Chinese threat to Taiwan. It seems, that's my only response. My strong suspicion. Anyway, Libya elections is something we were very excited about in March of 2021. It was like, holy cow, like finally, after a decade of having two separate governments, one in the East, one in the West, they had agreed on a single prime minister. Dabiba, was it prime minister or president? Dabiba, the election is for president, I believe. Dabiba, they agreed on a governing structure and to start doing things for these elections that were supposed to come in December. 2.8 million out of 7 million Libyans are registered to vote in the elections. Very exciting stuff. I was reading about this. I think I'll put the link down below. The first time in 50 years that Libyans would actually be able to vote. It's all very hopeful. The thing that made me most hopeful and most surprised and prompted me to make my video sort of celebrating this in what was it, however many months ago that was the idea that the government of national accord had sort of dissolved itself to create this new government or new apparatus. And the House of Representatives, the government in the East, hadn't dissolved itself, but it had sort of approved this and said, okay, let's go forward, let's do this. Now it appears that those two elements are clashing again, whereas like the new government is just really even the third generation of Western government and the Eastern government. So it's like, actually, have we really changed that much? And while it appears that the election for president will still happen in December, the legislative elections, which I would argue are probably more important, you're going to have a popularly elected figurehead with real powers, no doubt. I mean, do we even have a constitution yet? I don't think we do in Libya. But like the horse trading of what a unified legislature is going to look like is vitally important. And, that was supposedly going to happen in December. Now it's going to happen in January. There's all manner of disagreement over the steps that are going to be taken by the two. Now, again, we have to acknowledge two separately constituted governments, how they're going to allow themselves to be merged in January. I don't know. I am not so optimistic. Maybe you can correct me, Fadel, but I am not so optimistic. Yeah, Libya has no constitution, says Fadel. So yeah, that's pretty much what I have to say about Libya elections. I am less optimistic than I was 3 to 4 months ago. Regardless, I think it's been an interesting process. I'm glad that. I mean, it's freaking better than having Haftar, having Tripoli under siege, which is what we had from 2019 to early 2020. So, of course, Haftar, the wannabe strongman, former CIA plant, was apparently, I don't think he has formally announced, but everyone expects him. He has taken administrative steps with his military that would allow him to run for president. Gaddafi's son, who's a sort of a famous freak, is running for president. It's I don't know. Very little about Libyan news inspires confidence, but hey, the Libya surprised me by getting this far in the process. Perhaps they'll surprise me again by leading to even more positivity. Here's hoping. What happened? Okay. Okay, local cool stream says, okay, now I just feel embarrassed for China. We don't want to make China feel embarrassed, but yeah, in the context of a private patron's only thing, it's gobsmacking. Like, it's like we didn't just basically throw out strategic ambiguity. We have military forces on Taiwan. This was like the thing. Withdrawing our military forces from Taiwan is the only reason that Mao had many reasons that he wanted to be, allied with the United States against the Soviet Union. But it was one of the bare bones requirements of U.S.-China relations starting under Nixon was the U.S. military withdrawing from Taiwan. The U.S. military is back in Taiwan. And the extraordinary thing about this is like for a year now, like Noah Smith, Bloomberg, and big time Twitter fame, hundreds of thousands of Twitter followers, the U.S. Foreign policy establishment, the think tanks have been talking about, this crazy aggressive stuff that China is doing. China's so aggressive in China against Taiwan and saying such nasty things about Taiwan. But we now know that Trump put troops there. So this whole year of reporting about how crazy and aggressive China has been over Taiwan is bullshit, because that was just weak. In retrospect, now that we know what we know, that was weak, namby-pamby horseshit China reaction to the United States completely throwing over Taiwanese, the treatment of Taiwan that we've maintained for half a century. That is the basis of Chinese prosperity. That is the basis of Chinese-U.S. combination. Like, it's like, look, I am someone who believes that some renegotiation of the U.S.-China trade relationship is necessary. Does not work for the United States. Does not work for the working class in developed countries, making our electoral system unviable. The rise of Trump and Sanders. Something that needs to change. But it's insane to me that we insist on pretending that China is the aggressor here. China is not the aggressor. China is terrified and is reacting to the fact that we are throwing out the basis of the U.S.-Chinese relationship. I argue we have to renegotiate the basis of the U.S.-China trade relationship, but we should be honest, that's us doing it. That is not the Chinese. The Chinese have been tying themselves in knots. It's fascinating watching the standard arguments against the Chinese. 5-10 years ago, it was the Chinese are stealing our movies. They're like, they don't respect intellectual property. The Chinese have now clamped down on intellectual property within their own economy. They are making serious steps towards being able to join the TPP, which is something that was designed for the Chinese to not be able to join. They have reformed themselves constantly. They have, they have not instantly become Switzerland, but they have certainly transitioned vastly more towards, human happiness and, yes, even a democratic approach to things. It is the United States that has decided to revise our trade relationship, as we should, and as is our right to do. But it's fucking nuts that we're like, oh no, we're doing this thing we want to for our own interests that we have to do because China's mean. China is not mean. China is terrified, quite rightly, of the United States, as we have decided to throw over the trade policy that is one of the pillars of our relationship, and also now are basically just treating Taiwan like it's Hawaii. It's basically Hawaii now. And that is not just a complete renunciation of the founding agreement with China during the Cold War. It's also like an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party and the stability of a country of stability of a nuclear power of 1.4 billion people. I don't really think the Chinese Communist Party gives a shit about Taiwan. The Chinese people really do. And yeah, like, I don't like the Chinese Communist Party. I would like to see a peaceful transition away from the Chinese Communist Party, creating a situation where we could see the collapse of the Chinese country. And it's just like, no one in U.S. foreign policy circles thinks that peace is a good thing. Like, we insanely convince ourselves that places like Iran and China and Syria would be the great example of the past decade are places that are threats to us, which they are not. And then we ignore the fact that destroying these places, as we destroyed Syria, creates much greater threats to U.S. and world stability, U.S. and world economy than these places existing under their shitty systems are. Like, nobody acknowledges that. It just blows my mind that people are seriously working in the United States towards undermining Iranian solidity, towards I don't think balkanization of China is likely. I do think like overturning the Chinese Communist Party and possibly seeing like a crisis, a violent crisis in China. Which is like, that is not something the United States should want. That is not something anybody should want. That's insane. What we should want is like peaceful democratic transitions in these countries, which we have seen actually across Eastern Europe, across Latin America, across Asia. Like, Instead, we're like, no, we don't want to just, do the successful thing that worked against all the communists in Eastern Europe and all the authoritarians in Latin America. We want to divide your countries and like create chaos and destruction and refugee flows and the deaths of millions. Just fucking blows my mind. But yeah, like honestly, the only reaction that I can have from this, oh yeah, like all of the Taiwan news we've heard about Chinese aggression over the past year is bullshit, because all that Chinese aggression was kind of a weak sauce response to the fact that the Trump administration put troops in Taiwan. Like my only reaction to that is like, actually, Taiwan is really safe. Like we've done it. Like we've done it. We've renounced strategic ambiguity. We haven't done it like physically or whatnot. It was really interesting. So on Wednesday, October 6th, there was this very weird news story that came out saying that Biden had a call with Xi Jinping and that they had jointly agreed to honor the Taiwan agreement, which isn't something that actually exists. Like the understanding between China and the United States over Taiwan is in a number of communiques between the two countries, in the Taiwan Relations Act, clarifications of that from the Reagan administration. I mean, it's just a lot of, it's not a firm agreement, but the details of the agreement that Taiwan is not to be forced back into China by the Chinese. And in return, the United States is going to not act in a way that uses Taiwan directly against it. Like that sort of, that's the agreement. It's not actually a formal treaty or any kind of agreement. But, on Wednesday, October 6th, it was announced that Biden and Xi had this call saying that, oh, we're going to respect that. And I was like, oh, thank God. I ran a video a couple months back that was just like, yeah, the Trump administration basically renounced strategic ambiguity in its closing days. And the Biden administration has completely followed on with that. So I was like, oh, thank God. Okay, this is Biden and Xi being like, okay, we're going to get past the Trump interregnum. Now I realize it appears to me that this was sort of an attempt to get out ahead of the Thursday, October 7th revelation from the Wall Street Journal that the United States, and this is very carefully worded, I think it was Kelsey Atherton on Twitter pointed out, like, the way that this story is carefully worded is an indication that it was leaked in a certain way with government sources giving information in a very tailored way to the Wall Street Journal, or perhaps they had, gotten wind of this, decided to break this story, and then the U.S. military interacted with those reporters, probably with editors and publishers, into how exactly this was to be announced. But yeah, the what is in the Wall Street Journal is that there have been U.S. troops in Taiwan for over a year, and that should be the biggest news in the world right now. And the fact that it's just not, we're all just sort of like. Because the Chinese are insanely embarrassed by this. Everything that Xi Jinping, this idea that they're going to aggressively defend the vision of Chinese sovereignty that the Chinese people in mainland China really want, that's completely humiliated and undermined by this. And also, nobody in the U.S. wants to talk about this because this completely blows up the narrative of Chinese aggression that we've been talking about for the past year. We have U.S. troops in Taiwan. It is insane to me that nobody's talking about this, but nobody is. I think I should probably just do a freaking TikTok about this or something. I don't know. Whatever. Daniel Hale, this is something that I missed and someone in the comments brought up, and it's really embarrassing that I missed this, and it's really embarrassing that nobody's paying attention to this. This is Daniel Hale. Actually, I was reading a big profile of him, like, this can be oversold, 300 years later, you can be descended from all kinds of people, or 250 years later. But Daniel Hale, apparently a descendant of Nathan Hale, one of the most famous U.S. patriots, a guy who was captured spy working against the British during the American Revolution. I think his line is like, I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, before he was executed by the British. Nathan Hale, very big. I feel like, I think there's a statue of him on the Yale campus. Hale, Yale, no relation. But yeah, Nathan Hale, very big deal. Did they make a TV show about Nathan Hale recently? They make a TV show about everything. But Daniel Hale, a descendant of Nathan Hale, apparently to some degree, one of probably hundreds or thousands at this point, or at least of the Hale family. Was Nathan Hale killed before he had kids? I don't know. Became a whistleblower. And a whistleblower who dropped an extraordinary amount of really damaging information from the Washington Post. That's a reliable source, basically saying that over a 5-month period in Afghanistan, 90% of drone strikes killed the wrong people. It means that 90% of drone strikes supposedly aimed at terrorist enemies killed complete strangers, civilians, basically. We just murdered civilians. So like 90% of, there was this really in-depth reporting on the family we murdered in Afghanistan on the way out. That represents 90% of the drone strikes that we made in Afghanistan. Of course, you can caveat that was just over a 5-month period. That was But yeah, this is Afghanistan, nominally the place where we have the best intelligence resources. 90% of the people we killed with drones were innocent bystanders. I've got the link to the Washington Post in article in the description. But what's kind of like, so Daniel Hale was sentenced to 45 months in prison on July 27th. That's what I should have mentioned. I'm actually someone who doesn't. I think Edward Snowden is a hero who deserves a full pardon. I think Chelsea Manning belonged in jail. I think Daniel Hale should serve some time. I think that military officers should not be giving out secrets. Sorry, Hale was not an officer, nor was Manning, actually. But no, military, if you've got a member of your military who is publicizing state secrets, no matter how ridiculous those secrets it is that those things are secret, no matter how damning those things are to the U.S. government, I think there's an argument that Daniel Hale and Chelsea Manning are heroic people, but they also needed to go to jail. I don't appreciate. I'm not an advocate of abuse of these folks. I'm not an advocate of cruel and inhuman punishment. I'm not particularly angry about Barack Obama's pardoning of Chelsea Manning. But if you're a sworn member of the United States military or any military and you're giving away secrets, you should do some time. Maybe it's heroic civil disobedience you're doing, but there should be consequences, I think. Whereas Edward Snowden, actually, I think, is unreservedly a hero because the fact that Edward Snowden even existed, he was like a consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton who could access anybody's information, anybody in the world at great length. Like that, the fact that he existed was a scandal. The fact that there are U.S. military folks who deal with classified information that they should not be sending out is, I think, a principle that's worth preserving. Whereas, everything about Edward Snowden's existence and Booz Allen Hamilton's approach towards the NSA, everything about that was a horrific scandal that was worth revealing. Anyway, this is meaningless. But what is shocking, and I think there's actually a New York Magazine profile that does a better job than the article, than the link in the description, is it's really sad that when his revelations were coming out, he was arrested after the fact. I think his revelations were being published by The Intercept. I'd forgotten these revelations. I didn't engage with I didn't even read these articles. And the fact that not just the U.S. public, but myself as well, is just so far beyond even interacting with the horror of the drone war. I mean, the Washington Post, said, 90% of our drone strikes on a given period of time in a given location of Afghanistan killed innocent civilians instead of terrorists. 90%. And that's just a throwaway, it's part of the background noise. And I've never had the opportunity, even I have never really engaged with that before. That was just really striking to me. And that came out of a YouTube comment on the Afghanistan video on Tuesday. So yeah, I would like to read more about the Daniel Hale revelations and what it says about their drone program. But I just, haven't. Okay, well, we've got a lot of comments to deal with. Okay. Oh my gosh, so much going on. So many comments to go through. We are not going to finish, I don't think. Libya has no constitution. Skylar's logos, yes, in the lead, but maybe too radical for the German industrialists. This is German election talk. Everything is consent. Let's just do the German election contact. Right. Or we know, get to do Iraqi election. We'll just Skylarks absorb them in a coalition and incrementally move towards emissions goals. Yeah, the Green Party did not do as well as expected in Germany, or rather, they did about as well as expected in recent polling. But I mean, there was talk, I guess, in the spring over the summer that the Greens were going to be the big winners in the German election. I think all I really wanted to say about the German election, let's sort of do it now, is that, and I kind of did it in a YouTube community post a day or two back. Finally, it kind of looks like normalcy is reasserting itself. I am someone who's very focused on the averting Europe's fall into nationalism, populism, what have you, because obviously, European nationalism is one of the scariest forces in human history. So for me, the main takeaway from the German elections was that the AfD, which the Alternative for Deutschland, the I think virulently racist. Is that fair? Probably no longer quite as openly racist as it's becoming more respectable and gaining more political power. But anti-Europe party fell in its vote count. I think it got 12% in 2017 and like only 10% this time around. The Green Party, which was expected to win dramatically, has also normalized its, and I do not want to imply an equivalence between the Green Party and the AfD, but for the purposes of European politics, like it was sort of like this flight to the extremes was a real dynamic, and this sort of strong decline of the centrist parties. The SPD and the CDU, CSU folks, the center of German politics, while they are certainly weakened from where they were 20 years ago, it held. The center of German politics has held. The Green Party is becoming a more real electoral force. It hit its highest point ever, but in so doing, it is becoming it's becoming a less freaky force. The AfD, the right-wing thing, remains a freaky, horrifying force, but it is one with less power. I think probably, unfortunately, for folks who care a lot about climate, what's likely to, I think it seems, though, as Malta here might be correct me, it seems like the most likely result is going to be the SPD, the old school left-wing party, the party that has been like, the SPD has been a factor in German politics since the 1800s. They were strongly persecuted by the Nazis. They're likely to be the main part of the coalition that rules Germany, but they're going to have to let in the Greens, who they might like, because, the SPD is traditionally left-leaning, Greens is more left-leaning, but they're also going to have to let in the FDP, which is a more liberal in the European sense. So they're basically like a libertarian party, though, of course, they're not libertarian because they're Germans, but they're certainly like strongly pro-business, so they're going to probably... And a lot of people were hoping that the Greens would attain great power in Germany, and there would be this like sort of raft of new climate legislation. But it seems unlikely that that's going to happen because the FDP is also going to be in the coalition, and they're probably going to limit that sort of thing. But what I find heartening about the German elections is the fall in vote count of the Alternative for Deutschland, and sort of a return to normalcy. And I'm not particularly bothered. Like the center has held, but the center is falling away, and that's actually not a terrible thing that the center is falling away. I mean, the SPD is sort of like the British Labour Party. It's like meant to be the representative. Actually, there actually is organized labor. Germany is a country where organized labor is still a factor, and a very real factor. But like, it just like to have a political system in the 21st century that's still rooted in directly in post-World War II or even pre-World War II parties and approaches and like ways of looking at the world and ancient ideas of right and left. I think it's probably a good thing that that's breaking down a little bit. In the United States, the meanings of what Democrat and Republican are just shift. That's sort of what we've been doing for the past 150 years, and that's fine. But in Europe, actual, parties can rise and fall because of the way the parliamentary systems work. So it's not so heartbreaking to me that, the SPD or the Christian Social Democrats, Christian Social, I can't remember what it stands for. It's basically, I think the post-war settlement in most big European countries was sort of some variety of, Christian Democrat, conservative types against sort of more left-leaning labor types. And like that, like approach to the world, I mean, in a modern Europe where there isn't really a large-scale proletariat anymore, and there isn't really much Christianity anymore, it's kind of ridiculous that those are still the sort of ideological thing. So I'm happy to see that stuff fade, but fade slowly and peacefully, and not be replaced by like, they link, sort of, communism or the lunacy of the Alternative for Deutschland. So anyway, that's what I want to say about German elections. I've got that done. Comments. It's open the incremental move to emissions goals. Haftar's sons, Fadel says, Haftar's sons are also considering running in the Libyan elections, which is just gross. Fadel says, my history teacher also said some years ago that Americans are obsessed with World War II and they view foreign policy through that lens. 100%. I ran a video like 6 or 7 years ago called The Only History Washington, D.C. Knows. And everything is Munich, appeasement, 1938, which is absolutely farcical. Like I actually had to run like Putin is not Hitler. Like a figure becomes not just like people like really like, how can you compare people to Hitler? Because the Holocaust is so evil, yada, yada. And like, that's a completely valid argument. But like, for me, it's like, you can't compare anybody to Hitler until they have conquered 6 to 8 countries in 7 months. Like, and that's what Hitler did. Hitler took over a continent in half a year. Comparing anybody to Hitler who doesn't have that capability is asinine, like ridiculous. Like Saddam Hussein might have been able to take Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia is not a real country, but would he have been able to touch Turkey? Would he have been able to touch Iran? No, he tried and failed to take Iran. Saddam Hussein was a failed Hitler. Yet we called him Hitler and called attempts to appease his like rump little state, Munich or this, that, and the other thing. Like comparing people to Hitler is the dumbest fucking thing imaginable. And whenever like a U.S. political figure does that, it's like, yeah, you can call Xi Jinping like a potential Hitler, like after he conquers Japan and India, because that's like what Hitler did. Xi Jinping is never going to conquer Japan and India. Let me say that quite clearly. Some potential future Chinese government, maybe a century from now, if things go extraordinarily, I would argue perhaps impossibly well for China, while they go impossibly poorly for India and Japan, then yeah, maybe. But comparing people to Hitler, which is the only history that most people in Washington, D.C. knows, is a tremendous, tremendous problem. Good point, Fadel. Local extreme, Fadel, what do you know of the Makhali militias? I don't know anything about the Makhali militias. Are those the assholes in with the mass graves? I don't know. Scott Lux, Taiwan is an amazing country, people, and economy. There's semiconductor industry. Yes, Taiwan's lovely. It's great. And I think that strategic ambiguity, where neither China nor the U.S. takes a particularly firm approach towards it, while the U.S. provides Taiwan all the weapons it needs to defend itself, was the right approach. I think that works. Like I made a video years ago arguing with myself about Taiwan, talking about the Chinese interest in Taiwan and the Taiwanese people's interested in Taiwan, and I came to the conclusion that yes, strategic ambiguity is perfect. because we don't embarrass China, but China knows they can't actually invade Taiwan. The fact that we are overturning that is insane. Jan Lapper, thanks for the casual Switzerland comparison. Always brings me great joy. Well, I'm happy to help, Jan. Fadel, logical stream. I know they are a bunch of thugs. This would be the Magdali militias, presumably. Jan Lapper, though perhaps people should say it's not Norway. They have a much more generous and equitable system. That is sort of true. That is very interesting. People used to, it's fascinating, like, people used to be a lot more engaged with the Switzerland model. I remember reading a book where this guy was just obsessed with how well Switzerland does everything. And yeah, I think traditionally, back when people on the right actually thought about governing structures a little bit, Switzerland was sort of seen as a more a model of a political organization that was more right-leaning as opposed to the left-leaning left-leaning Scandinavian countries, though both are sort of very similarly successful. I would argue because of Protestantism, actually, not because of some kind of work ethic or some horse shit, but because 500 years ago, in many Swiss cantons and in Scandinavia, both regions were taken over by folks who believed it was necessary, or not taken over, with the people who ran these places became convinced that it was necessary to read the Bible to go to heaven, and that everybody should be literate. And I think that's the main reason that Switzerland and Scandinavia have such a head start on everybody, is because they've been literate for 500 years, which is not the case for really anywhere else. Certainly not the United States or most of Western Europe. Let's see. Our thugs, the problem. Brandon Commander says the problem with the Taiwan debacle is that China cannot retreat. The U.S. can. I don't know if they would want to because of the chip situation. However, they might argue it's in our national interests to defend them. The chip thing I don't find particularly impressive. It's like, it's such a, I mean, it's great. Like, let's talk about the semiconductor problem. Let's do what we need to diversify away our, but it seems like such a manufactured short-term thing. Like, I do not believe, especially after the past year, I do not believe that Taiwan is in any kind of imminent danger. I think the main lesson of like, oh, wow, the entire world's semiconductor industry is concentrated in one of the most geopolitically fraught places in the world. That's kind of a bad idea. Maybe we should move it out of there. I think that while that's not an immediate thing you can do, it is something you can do over 2 to 5 to 10 years. And I don't think Taiwan is in any meaningful danger before that. So like I think a more interesting question about like when you are faced with all of our semiconductors are in Taiwan, it means the US has a national interest in defending Taiwan. I think your first question would be like, why the fuck is all of our semiconductor stuff in Taiwan? Like, is that a conscious decision by the Taiwanese government or business? In that it's easier to do that than develop their own missile technology and capability to defend themselves. Like, I'd be a little more interested when I see that's like, why did that happen? And I'm not sure there's as much critical coverage of why that happened as there ought to be. Also, I think it's probably a little oversold, that sort of chip reliance. I mean, it's not like we don't know, like in the context of wartime, as we've seen in the context of vaccine development, like people are like, I think people are still taking like I don't want to like taking an attitude, well, like, in the normal course of human events, it takes 5 to 10 years to develop the kind of semiconductor capacity you need. Well, yeah, in the normal course of human events, it takes 10 to 30 years to develop the kind of vaccine technology you would have needed to deal with COVID. If China took Taiwan, like the whole like, well, can Intel get the right expertise and funding it needs to build the right number of fabs? Like, if China took Taiwan and its semiconductor industry, the United States military would actually like get, the US government would put the kinds of resources behind semiconductors that were put behind these COVID vaccines that were developed extraordinarily quickly, very quickly. So it would go from like, oh, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to build up a semiconductor industry. If China actually took Taiwan and stopped selling semiconductors, I presume it would take 6 months or 3 months, rather than 5 to 10 years to set up functioning semiconductor stuff. These blockades are not like technology related; they are financing related. Yeah. So yeah. Local Extreme says, if Taiwan has hula girls, I might turn into a China hawk and defend nukes for it. Interesting approach. Fado says the GNA was desperate for allies at that point. The GNA allied itself with the Salafist militia in order to resist Haftar. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I tend to be like, Haftar did these nasty mass murders. Well, it was sort of nasty militias that were allied with Haftar, and at some points were also allied with Haftar's enemies. Libya's a mess. We shouldn't have destroyed it. Fadel, my understanding is they allied with Haftar. They fought against Haftar back in 2017 and 2018. Brandon Commando is at the same time, Taiwan is not Afghanistan. The U.S., like Athens, is the hegemonic superpower of the seas and would probably rally either Japan or India to help in some shape or form. Like, I just, especially after the past year and week, I just don't believe any threat to Taiwan is credible. I think the U.S. government has actively tried to get China to try to invade. Practically, it's the only way I can interpret our somewhat insane actions under Trump and Biden. Or we just wanted to spark a real reaction out of China, and I think we pretty clearly demonstrated that China is not capable of it. So Fadel, I guess, again, talking about Libyan militias, saying they're kind of like a mob, but a mob that believes in Salafism. Local Extreme says, Fadel, so the Taliban with less money. And Fadel says yes. Scott Locks, Jan Lopper, I flew into Geneva once to go skiing in Chamonix, France. I want to go back. It seemed very beautiful and larger than I thought. Yeah, my understanding is Switzerland's amazing, but it's so expensive. Oh my God, it's so expensive. Okay, where are we at? Taliban, no, that's okay. Brandon Commander, what is it with Americans and Greek and Roman analogies? Other empires exist, Make an analogy about the Tokugawa shogunate or the Umayyads or something. Well, that's a European thing. Like there's a tremendous amount of intellectual investment. I think I did a freaking TED talk about this once. Just go TEDx or Robert Morris, it'll come up. Like there's a tremendous amount of investment in all of Western civilization, even pre-Enlightenment, from the Renaissance on down, in this idea that the Romans and the Greeks are our intellectual predecessors. And I would argue that actually people need to engage with that tradition if you're going to understand anything about U.S. politics, history, or even Western European politics and history of the past 500 years. Not because those parallels are smart or intelligent, but because these are parallels. These are the ways that people were thinking for 500 years. But yeah, I guess you're being like, that's less so now. But up until about 50 years ago, that was the absolute bedrock of every European and American political thinker figure, was the relationship with the classical world. That is fading now. But really important to sort of the Western intellectual tradition. And I talk about the inappropriateness of comparing the U.S. and British empires to Greek and Roman empires in my book, Avoiding the British Empire, which you should all check out, which, presumably most of you have as patrons. Jan Lauber talking about Geneva. Jan Lauber says, thank you, Rob, for enlightening me that Nathan Hale is not just merely a spacecraft in the expanse. It's true. It's true. Nathan Hale is a strangely significant figure for a lot of folks. The Expanse is a great television series. It was on Sci-Fi, and then Sci-Fi canceled it, and Jeff Bezos liked it so much, and also liked the idea of talking about spaceflight so much, that he purchased it so there could be another 2 seasons. Something I'm very grateful to Jeff Bezos for. It's a great show. I think sixth and final season, sadly. It's a better series of books. I highly recommend reading the books, which I enjoy thoroughly. Fado says, what are your thoughts on Bernie Sanders' top foreign policy advisor, Matt Duss? I love Matt Duss. I think he's fun. I think he's it's kind of extraordinary to see I mean, a non-Jewish guy with the freedom of range he's had to be as explicit about what we're doing to the Palestinians was kind of interesting. He certainly goes further than I would and do on this channel, and he does that while being, working within Washington D.C. to some extent. It's a pretty impressive dude, I think. And also, of course, being suspicious of Israel Palestine makes him pretty great on most Middle East stuff. And so Matt Duss is generally I'm pretty much a fan of. Rami Ilkilich says, I have a reluctant suggestion. Do you think it might be fun to do this on Zoom once in a while? We're not that many. It might just work maybe once a year or so. Local Cool Extreme says, yes, we're actually working on using, that's something that Discord can be used for. So yeah, we are already thinking about that. We will do that. Scott Locks, SPD knows they have to shift to a digital world. Rami Ilkilich says, great, thanks. The Iraqi elections are happening tomorrow. Yes, and I've said nothing about the Iraqi elections. Okay, that is the next item. The Iraqi elections, as I've said many, many times, you've all heard me like a broken record. I think I've done a very bad job with Iraq in the past, and of course, I've been too much of a chicken to go back and correct myself. My understanding of what's happening with the Iraqi elections is that throughout 2019, there were very heartening, both for me and really even for U.S. empire, militarist fans, very heartening process of protests against the Iranian influence within Iraq. I was very, very happy to see, really brutally suppressed by the government at the time, but it was really looking like the Iraqis were very interested in throwing off the Iranian influence, which is, great. And then, of course, the United States assassinated Soleimani along with highly placed Iraqi figures that created an incredible backlash to the backlash against Iran and sort of provided great cover for the pro-Iran elements. We now have an early election happening tomorrow. Unfortunately, I don't think it doesn't appear to me that many people are particularly optimistic about what's going to happen. A lot of the Iraqi public at this point, after the horrors of COVID, feeling pretty beat up, might not show up in great numbers. A lot of the folks on the ballot are sort of the usual suspects. I don't know. I'm not seeing a great deal of optimism about it. I'm not particularly optimistic about it. Really wish that, we hadn't turned the entire Iraqi public against us again by killing Soleimani. But it is nice that they are still angrier at Iran than they are at us at this point. Seems to be the consensus. I don't know. But yeah, we'll see. We shall see. But yeah, I just haven't really thought through Iraq, and I probably should. So wow, it's been over 2 hours, so we should probably call it. I've got a number of items. I'll just go through very quickly. Debt ceiling equals North Korea. I'd sort of mentioned this on Twitter, but like North Korea and the U.S. debt ceiling are two things that like have this potential, this incredible apocalyptic potential, but you can usually safely ignore them completely because it seems like the same thing happens. It's like, oh my God, apocalypse could happen. And like, even more so in the post-COVID era when, through swap lines and all kinds of financial chicanery, the United States Federal Reserve, the US dollar is even more central to how the entire system works than it was prior to COVID. The idea of the US defaulting on its debt obligations is insane. It's always been insane. It's always been this really just lunatic thing that the Republicans have threatened us with, that have kept anything else from getting done in Washington D.C. for months at a time. Has actively shut down the government a couple times. Just fucking idiocy. And with the real potential, like if you wanted to talk about like, it seems like the crash will never come. Yeah, U.S. defaulting on its debt. Something hilarious. It would actually probably create a demand for dollars because of the weirdness of how our system works. But yeah, financial crashes everywhere. Apocalypse, 2008, squared, just nightmare time. But it's a lot like North Korea, where like, yeah, theoretically this could end up in nuclear war, but it's just the same. Every 2 to 5 years we get super worked up over North Korea, and then nothing happens, and everything stays exactly the same. And every 2 years at this point, it seems like, or whenever a Democrat is president, the Republicans threaten financial apocalypse with the debt ceiling thing. We all go back and forth. Everybody's got an opinion. We talk about minting coins, and then inevitably there's some kind of thing. So you can actually get away without ever talking about or learning about the debt ceiling in North Korea. And I mean, who knows? One of these times it could be apocalypse. But I have thus far sort of realized that I can sort of get away with not knowing anything about either of these things. Anyway, so that's what I have to say about that. Euro energy crisis. Yeah, I don't know. I think I see a lot of people getting worried about a backlash against European greenery. I think that is a real concern. But I do kind of wonder, it's like they really believe in climate change in Europe. Like they really believe in climate change, really believe in taking steps against climate change. I think like if we had a similar energy crisis in the United States, would there be a huge backlash against greenery? Probably, yes. But I'm wondering if like this is another example of the U.S. sort of applying U.S. political views on things to Europe. Like we were like, oh, wow, man, EU's been fucking up so badly. They're all going to get sick of the EU and all want to leave. That was an assumption that I fell into at some points over the past decade that appears to have been wrong. Is this like, oh, there's going to be a big European backlash against green politics, green approaches to things? Is that something that we have to worry about? Maybe that's more of a U.S. concern. The Pandora Papers, something else that really important journalism that I should engage with. I've been sort of weird about the Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, because like they're dumping stuff that's not actually illegal. And as someone who's got a history in stock brokerage and especially international corporate law, I'm sort of like, well, this shit ain't illegal. Some of the work I did was related to some of these sorts of structures. So I'm a little weirded out, but I think it's instructive that like a lot of the stuff that myself as a corporate attorney or someone who's, mucked about with private equity, this, that, and the other thing now and again, a lot of the stuff that I find to just be the normal bread and butter of the way business works in the world is stuff that the general public is like, what do you mean that's what people do legally? They have these structures. Probably the biggest fallout of the Pandora Papers is the King of Jordan, who was already sort of having a difficult time, being revealed to have something like $80 to $100 million worth of overseas property set up, owned through shell companies. That's not great. That's sort of the biggest thing. But one ramification that I think is very interesting, and I wonder if the Pandora Papers sort of helped push this along, is like we apparently have an international agreement on a baseline for corporate tax that even Ireland was forced to sign on to. This is news from yesterday that I didn't get a chance to engage with, and that is very, very surprising. Now, when we're talking about the revelations of the Pandora Papers, the shell companies, this, that, and the other thing, obviously completely different section of international law and whatnot than internationally harmonized corporate taxes. But it is among that sort of same genre of things. Something that in my more libertarian youth I would have been appalled by, but as I get older and sort of just becomes clear to me in part through these document dumps, just like the extraordinary abuses of tax shelters, tax havens, what have you. I have become more sympathetic to the idea of a harmonized international corporate tax, and that is something very stealthily that the Biden administration is pushing. Perhaps I should do so many things we've talked about today that I should research more, but don't. There are only so many hours and hours in a day and days in a year. The German elections we covered already. The Tunisian femme washing, which is it's fascinating. So at some point over the past weeks, the Tunisian president who took power, closed the parliament on July 25th, appointed a new prime minister who happened to be a woman. And I think this is very savvy because if you employ a, is this the first female prime minister in the Arab world? Probably, right? I can't think of another example. So like a Lebanese female prime minister at some point, maybe. I honestly can't think of another example. Which is something that people would be making a much bigger deal about if if she wasn't a, I think she's some obscure academic without political weight, appointed by this president who has crushed the only surviving Arab Spring democracy experiment, basically appointed to be his. I mean, who knows? Maybe it'll all work out super like Switzerland or Norway or whatever, but I don't think so. I think she's pretty generally recommended to be sort of a pawn of this guy. But it is kind of fascinating to see the degree to which that may or may not work. Will he get? So he's got about a solid 2 months now since he closed the parliament. Is he going to get another couple months of grace period because he appointed a woman? I would argue probably, but it's sort of a fascinating thing. That I would have talked about more if we weren't out of time. Poland was something that folks had suggested. Poland is the peace. This is terrible acronym in English. But the Polish right-wing party has had a running series of battles with with Brussels around an array of things. But I think one of the most important is the legal and I think constitutional changes that the right-wing party in Poland has made to the judiciary, and the European courts and European bureaucracies have decided that the Polish judiciary is now inadequately independent from the government, and there are a lot of ways that I am unsympathetic to Poland and Hungary. They're often perhaps unfairly put together as sort of right-wing governments that sort of bridle under Brussels control. Obviously, I agree it's pretty hypocritical for these countries to be complaining so much, considering the amount of money that they get from Brussels, from the EU. However, I do have some sympathy. It's just sort of like, not with Orban in Hungary. I mean, he's very clearly been acting to crush any dissent. But like with the Polish government, I mean, it's like they should be able to have some control of how their judiciary works. Poland is a country that from the 1790s until 1989, like when I was a 10-year-old, was for 200 years was controlled as a colonial controlled and divided up. It was a colonized people. And I do, with these interactions with Poland and the EU, yes, I 100%, agree that Poland's sort of right-wing stances, the Polish government sort of right-wing stances, anti-immigrant stuff, it's all rather tiresome, but also like the Polish government, and I can see why the Polish government and the Polish people would want to assert itself. And like I have a little more sympathy towards just general Eastern European attempts to go their own way in small ways than I think most people do. I think the Polish, there are elements within the Polish political world that want to assert themselves in ways, and I think they should be allowed to assert themselves. It's democracy, damn it. So, but I haven't done an intricate. Maybe if I read the briefs from the European government, I'd say, oh wait, well, no, the Polish are completely out of line here. But my sort of limited read on this is like, well, actually, like I'm a little more sympathetic to the Polish here than most would indicate. Perhaps it's because of my Polish lineage. Okay, let's go through these comments very quickly. The Iraq elections are happening tomorrow. I think we've breeze through all of the items. Scott likes October 31st will attempt launch date of James Webb Telescope on the EU Ariane rocket from French Guiana. Science without weapons, international cooperation. Yes. I mean, these things sound very nice. I don't know enough about the James Webb Telescope. That's interesting. James Webb. I mean, isn't that a U.S. Congressperson? I like space. Space is fun. Scott Lux, it would be amazing if that telescope actually works. Fingers crossed. Well, everybody knows about this telescope except for me. I should clearly look into it. Scott Lux says the Swiss make some of the instruments for the James Webb. Interesting. Jan Lapper, I'm very impressed by your knowledge of the Christian Reformation in Europe, though intuitively I must disagree, as the same Lutheran reform took place in parts of Germany. Well, yeah, but that's key. Like Lutheran reform happened in parts of Germany, and it was those parts of Germany that ended up dominating the unified Germany. Bavaria, traditionally Catholic Bavaria, has made great strides in the past century, but was kind of a bit of a backwater. And I do think that not because of not to go full. Was it Max Weber with his Protestant work ethic? I think that's all kind of horse shit. But just quite simply that, and this is also a key part of the success of the Dutch Republic and the English, other areas that were more Protestant, is just simply the century or two's worth of head start on mass literacy generally made these, Germany was divided and problematic all the way up until 1870, not because the Germans were sort of naturally poor and disorganized, but because the powers of Europe were very interested in keeping them divided. And the parts that ended up leading the unification of Germany were very Protestant Prussia. Because those areas, I think, by and large, were more financially successful, and it's fair to characterize them as such. And I think that I think so. It's the same thing. The Lutheran basis, emphasis on literacy made Germany, helped to build the eventual German miracle. There were structural political reasons why Germany was not able to assert itself, earlier. I think that the Protestant Reformation and its emphasis on literacy made a huge difference for tons of countries. Jan Leber, I would argue that Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries, are wealthy because we were largely spared World War I and World War II. The Nazis occupied Norway quite viciously. The Finnish, so Sweden was spared World War I and World War II to a degree. The Finnish won a really ruinous war with the Soviets. And then, of course, had to give up a lot of their territory in the aftermath of World War II. Switzerland did avoid World War I and World War II, and that's very important for sure. Denmark and Norway were occupied, but not heavily bombed or pillaged. They weren't. Ouch. Brando Commander says, just call China what it actually is, West Taiwan. Oof. Yeah. Jan Lapper, prior to the Great Depression, there was mass immigration from Switzerland and North America. This is where the Amish come from after all. That's interesting. I think there's a wide variety of Amish Mennonites that come from across, not just from Switzerland, right? I assume they came from a lot of Central Europe, a lot of Germans as well, but hadn't really thought about the Swiss reaction to the Amish. But no, unquestionably, I'm not arguing that it instantly translated. I'm not arguing that literacy instantly translated Scandinavia and the Swiss into world beaters or happy rich countries. I'm saying that over centuries, the accretion of a tradition of literacy enabled the Scandinavia and Switzerland to take vastly better advantage of the post-war World War II environment than Kenya or Thailand or Italy did. It's that's the point that I'm making. I'm not making perhaps quite as strong a point as you might be thinking I'm making. Okay, Scott Locks, message retracted. Jan Lapper, Brandon Commando. I have done that in China as a provocative thing when I was a teenager. Do not recommend. Jesus. Wow. Okay. Calling China West Taiwan. Wow, that's quite something. Okay. Merton Mufti says sci-fi cancels everything, like Battlestar Galactica, Stargate shows. I thought Battlestar Galactica was given the run it needed to become a bit of a self-mockery. I remember loving that show and then eventually being like, okay, well, what are we doing here? Fado says Ted Cruz is holding the U.S. government hostage over Biden, not sanctioning Germany over Nord Stream. That is just fucking unbelievable. Ted Cruz is such a goddamn clown. It's interesting. I made a video, 5-6 years ago, about his. That's an excuse to repost that as a community thing. He's had a Ukraine hard-on for quite some time. I don't know. Maybe he's personally legitimately convinced that the Ukrainians are some amazing avatars of democracy and peace instead of I don't know. I visited Ukraine and the prevalence of anti-Semitism there is it is directly in your face. Like I remember in Lvov, it's Lvov or Lviv, or certainly not Lemberg. It's a city that, depending on what you call it, you're associating yourself with one or another section of the nationalists. But this beautiful old city, and there's this beautiful, there's a standard, decent, respectful monument to a synagogue that had been burned down by the Nazis. And then right next to it is I kid you not, an anti-Semitic theme restaurant with refrigerator magnets of anti-Semitic caricatures. Really impacted for all time my sympathy or lack thereof with Ukraine. But anyway, I think Cruz, maybe he really is convinced that the Ukrainians are these, democratic avatars. Maybe he's bought off in some way. But yeah, he takes these really absurd stances. This idea that we should sanction one of our closest and richest allies over how it chooses to attain its energy resources. I assure you that Germany has a much larger stake in whether or not Russia becomes aggressive in Europe again. So the idea that we're going to not just make these fucking decisions for them related to Nord Stream 2, but also, sanction them is always struck me as insanity. And it was a rare feat of intelligence that the Biden administration quashed that. So I don't think Ted Cruz is, it's not the government shutdown thing. What he's doing is Ted Cruz is blocking any appointment of any high-level ambassador anywhere in the world because Biden refused to sanction Germany, one of our largest allies. That is truly insane. Local Cool Extreme says, I can't even muster enough energy to be upset over Ted Cruz's shenanigans anymore. That makes sense to me. Fadel says, it looks like Egypt is going to normalize relations with Israel. Well, Egypt normalized relations with Israel in 1979. I mean, that's the Camp David Accords. But actually, no, but it's true. I mean, Egypt, and I think Jordan as well, has the normalization with Israel was always, somewhat mediated or somewhat smaller. It was like, okay, we're at peace, but we still, we don't have plane connections. We don't have real trade relations, what have you. So Egyptian planes are now flying to Israel. That's a big step. Sisi and Bennett are now talking about how great the peace is between them. That's also a huge step. I wonder what Sisi was given in return for that. Probably pretty fucking significant, I would think. It's the Abraham Accords. I ran videos that were suspicious of them. But yeah, I mean, by the same token as it's frustrating that, I find it tremendously frustrating when the U.S. government sacrifices the interests of 400 million Arab people on the altar of, Israel-Palestine. That was why I found aspects of the Abraham Accords so frustrating. I also find it frustrating when other people from the opposite direction, even pro-Palestinian forces, want to sacrifice the success, prosperity of 400 million Arabs on the altar of Israel-Palestine. So yeah, maybe the Abraham Accords, not the worst thing. So yeah. Martin Muftio says the issue with Pandora isn't that the process is legal. I think it is how these folks are able to amass this much wealth in the first place to be able to hide legally. I agree. No, I agree with the. It's just interesting because I do come from sort of the context where it's just like, this is all legal. We make money doing this professionally. So it is interesting seeing perhaps the more accurate vision of the general public, or at least journalists who are like, this is fucked up. This is fucked up that this amount of money is being collected and hidden. Scott Locke says Webb was head of NASA, and Fadel says very cryptically, officially. I think that's everything. I think I've made it through all the comments. Thank you all for being here. I don't need to pitch you guys on anything. Yeah, I am incredibly frustrated recently just by how YouTube does not put my stuff in front of people anymore, and it's very sad. I'm going to keep using YouTube because, you know, it does give me access to a certain small subject of my subscribers. And but yeah, if you guys haven't signed up on TikTok, and you are on TikTok, I mean, don't freaking sign up on TikTok just for me. But yeah, I think I'm doing more stuff on TikTok. I'm going to start thinking about more ways to try to go viral on TikTok. I did a great TikTok, I thought, yesterday. Crucially learned that swearing is, I mean, I don't think that my video yesterday was any more subversive than anything else I've done. But I swore in the first, I said fucking in the first like 20 seconds of my TikTok video, and they didn't show my video to anybody. It's just kind of interesting. I thought that was a pretty good video over on TikTok talking about what the U.S. would do in Afghanistan now if it were smart. But yeah, I think I need to focus on TikTok a little bit more because I mean, over the past 3 months, I've picked up 1,700 subscribers over there in YouTube, even after doing a collaboration with Caspian Report, pretty much the biggest guy in geopolitics on YouTube. I did pick up 300 subscribers, which was great, but I did in a single day. But yeah, I probably have picked up over the 3-month period, 320 subscribers. So yeah, I think I'm going to start putting more energy into TikTok, while also, you know, retaining the content, keeping up quality content on YouTube as well. But yeah, if you aren't following me at TikTok at More Freedom Foundation, please do. And what was I going to say? Oh, there's more questions. Yeah, Local Cool Extreme says, I think that's a very good parallel. The more I look up the Abraham Accords, the more I'm convinced that Palestine's statehood is turning into Tibet's freedom or Hong Kong's autonomy. Real bleak. It's just not something that's going to happen. Like, you can do your hashtag Free Palestine. You can do your there was a window in the 90s when some kind of Palestinian statehood was possible. And absolutely, the lion's share of the blame goes to the by far more powerful actor, the Israeli government here. It is inexcusable. I think going forward, we have to accept that Israel has a subject people, and that's just the way it's going to be. So Israel absolutely should be condemned when it abuses that subject people. But yeah, the whole idea that Palestine's going to have its own state, it's fantastical. And I mean, there were it's true. The right of return was something that was never going to be viable. And I think pushing for that probably made it easier for Israel to sabotage a real resolution of the conflict. But yeah, no, it's pretty grim stuff. I think I said as much in a live video, which will, sort of in a public live video, it's people aren't gonna do it. I should probably, the next time Israel Palestine crops up, the next time they start slaughtering people in Gaza, I'll probably just run a video, a produced video pointing out this is a silly thing that we're pretending is still a conflict. It's we should assume that Israel is an apartheid state with a subject people, and either continue to associate with it or disassociate from it, as the U.S. public, as we see fit. It's not an open issue anymore. Yale Narber says, thank you for your time. Yale Narber says, I would gladly chat with all of you on Discord. Yes, as far as pitching, Discord. There is a link. If perhaps you were like me and had no idea what a Discord server was, before folks convinced me to look into it, but it's now currently functioning as sort of a ongoing discussion between patrons about topics that we might need to cover, just make me aware of stuff. And now that I've figured out how to put it on my desktop as well as my phone, we'll have the opportunity to do an actual sort of discussion, as we were talking about. We might even do a test as early as this week at some point if I can. It's kind of a weirdly slammed week, but we're definitely going to use Discord for patrons type stuff. Quite possibly, as Jan was suggesting, a sort of like a Zoom call between the patrons. So it isn't just me talking for 2 hours. You guys don't just love hearing me talk for 2 hours. We might do sort of a Zoom call type thing through Discord, which facilitates that somewhat easily. So we might try to do that at some point in the next week or two. More questions. What's your thoughts on Max Abrams is interesting because Max Abrams is a guy who's tremendously suspicious of. He's a terrorism expert, which means he probably takes Islamic terrorism a lot more seriously than I do. But because he actually takes it seriously and has actually thought about these things, knows that our policy in Syria has been insane, that we are essentially allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria and Yemen, has spoken truthfully about the silliness of our Islamic State focus and our approach to Assad. So he's really fun and acerbic and constantly ragging on the U.S. policy in the Middle East. So I find myself retweeting him on often. He's got a good turn of phrase. He's kind of amusing, and he's fun to fun to retweet. He also makes a lot of people really uncomfortable on the left because he almost uniquely combines this extreme cynicism about U.S. Middle East policy with a deep commitment to Israel. I am extremely hesitant to describe a Jewish person as a Zionist, even though I shouldn't because that's a technical term. But I think he's an American who's very committed. He's a Jewish American who's very committed to Israel. And that is not often the case for folks who are complaining about U.S. Syria policy. I think it does more typically organize the people who are big fans, huge advocates for Israel. I think he's, even though it's really interesting when he talks about Iran because he knows what's going on in the region. He would, I think, agree that the United States is sort of an insane aggressor. At the same time, he also, I think, believes that Iran is a real threat to Israel. And so, I think perhaps what Fadel is alluding to is he makes a lot of folks on the left, a lot of anti-interventionist folks, really confused because his views on Syria and Yemen and often on Iran are so good and so correct and so right, and so suspicious of the United States. Yet at the same time, he's also a huge advocate for Israel, I think Zionist is an accurate term. And I think that definitely throws a lot of people off. But I continue to retweet him because I think it's important for there to be ideological diversity supporting the truth. And I think Max Abrams is a voice for truth in Syria, and accuracy about what's actually been happening there. And how instrumental the United States has been in destroying it. Though honestly, it's like because I'm when I'm replying to Max Abrams, it's most often because he loves to blame Turkey for the Islamic State in Syria. Really, hates Erdogan because Erdogan has been vocal against Israel. And then of course, I'm like, Max, Turkey did that because we asked them to, and he's like, yes, that's true. But yeah, he tends to. It is sort of fascinating, and I think would confuses people. Does that answer your question, Fado? What to think about Max Abrams? I love him. I think he's fun. But I can see why a lot of folks who care about Palestine would not be a big fan of Max Abrams. Lovely talk. Thanks. Farzam, could you please re-upload your TikTok content here if it's not too much of an inconvenience? I'm concerned about that because I think that, I mean, I don't know, like maybe I need to stop thinking about what I've done to crush my YouTube thing. But I worry that uploading those 3-minute TikTok things, might impact my watch time on YouTube in a negative way. Because watch time is very important. You might have noticed how my videos have gotten longer. That's one of the key might be problems. My videos were too short. So when I upload like a 3-minute TikTok, I might screw up my stats in ways that are bad. So that's why I didn't upload this. I mean, if they're, I don't know, that's, yeah, maybe I should do TikTok compilations or something. Actually, yeah, maybe if I step up, if I do like 2 or 3 TikToks a week, then I can upload them here, and they're 9 to 10 minutes long. So like maybe like every 4th TikTok, I'll upload it as a compilation here. Yeah, maybe that. I don't know, whatever. But yeah, thank you, Farzam. I hear that. There are reasons why I have not been uploading each as a standalone TikTok, but yeah. Farzam, if you join the Discord, I'll post the TikToks there and video discussions. Like you don't, crucially, yeah, if you get the Discord, if you get the TikTok link, so I upload on TikTok every day, but it's usually just cut up old YouTube videos. Probably over the past 3 months, I've got like 5 or 10 original TikTok videos. Yeah, and if Loga just posts the link, you can access that without signing up for TikTok from your desktop. You can access the TikTok videos as they come out. It'd be great if you could do that, Loga. Yeah, Fadel says, talking about Max Abrams, he's a confusing figure. He's liked some pretty gross tweets about Ilhan. Yeah, true. Yeah, so Max Abrams, like, he's absolutely right about Syria, like a really powerful voice on like how gross the U.S. policy towards Syria has been and how bad Washington, D.C. think tanks are. But he also is, has the typical bigoted approach to Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and the Squad because they are so vocally against Israeli occupation. So, yeah, I mean, Max Abrams, complicated figure, but regardless, I think that if you're mocking Washington D.C. policy, you're gonna get some love from me. Jan Lepper says, I have to leave. Thank you again. It's always enjoyable to have this small group stream. Look forward to next month. And yeah, I think we'll probably do a Discord either this week or next week where we can all like sort of chat. And maybe it'll go well, maybe it'll go horribly, whatever. We're gonna give it a shot. Okay. Thank you. This was awesome. It's been 2.5 hours. I think that's enough. Y'all are the best, and grateful to have you here. End stream. And